So welcome to this final recorded session of CVSP 206. In this last video, I'm just going to wrap up and take you through the rest of the Hobbes text, which we already started reading last time. You will recall, if you were in class or you watched the previous video of class, that to start off, so Hobbes, we're in the realm of political theory. In particular, I emphasized how Hobbes's political theory is, and in fact political science as a discipline, kind of commences with Hobbes, what kind of the central idea is that the kind of breakthroughs that occurred in natural science in this period could be extended to all other areas of human activity, including political activity. In particular, Hobbes himself was something of a natural scientist. He was interested in the mechanical view of nature, which of course was defended in particular by Descartes. In that mechanical view of nature, many people who thought of that as like the primary form of science instead of the inductive kind of method of Bacon, those who were more mechanistic in their thought, also for that reason naturally thought that the way that we build science is by building models based upon first principles that we discover and through the process of deduction, right? That's the importance of a model, is that you can construct the model in the simplest possible way with the simplest possible principles and determine or deduce the properties of the thing you are modeling from the principles of the model. And if those seem to agree with reality, at least that's how we do it today, then we conclude that the model is a good one, right? So Hobbes adopted that kind of idea. And so what we see in the Leviathan is an attempt to, first of all, isolate the first principles of political knowledge of political life, political science, and then to construct a model of the ideal, perfect government based on those principles, right? Now, last time we went into a little more detail. So we talked about how he compares the Leviathan itself to an artificial man, and man's activity in creating the Leviathan or the state as analogous to the activity by which God creates regular men, right? So in the Leviathan, man brings together other men as his material and constructs an enormous beast of a man, which is artificial, and that is the Commonwealth or the state. Or he gives it this odd title, the Leviathan, right? Another thing we saw last time in these first sections was that Hobbes explains to us his methodology. His methodology, in some ways, I stressed, is similar to Descartes. It's similar to Descartes in the sense that it's introspective. So we look for the first principles and we try to know everything from those first principles. And the way we find those first principles is by looking within ourselves. Secondly, like Descartes, it's deductive. The book is deductive. When we find those first principles, then we will try to deduce the consequences of them. Now, beyond that, there are a great many differences with Descartes. Hobbes is a mechanist, a pure mechanist. He believes that all that exists in the world is matter and machines. Human beings are nothing but machines. Life is nothing but the motion of our limbs. But Descartes, on the other hand, we had this idea that there are two different kinds of stuffs in the universe. Thought, souls, and bodies, physical bodies. So in that respect, they're completely different. Also, Descartes had this idea of examining those thoughts in our minds and coming up with some kind of certainty through clear and distinct ideas. Hobbes instead offers the idea that the way to build and to discover the first principles of a political theory, the first thing we have to do is to know what states are made out of, namely human beings. And the way to understand human beings is not by what they say or what they do, but by learning to read what they say and they do through the key, he calls it, of our own self-knowledge. So we should always ask ourselves, we shouldn't ask ourselves, what do people say other people do, or why they do things. Or again, we shouldn't read books about what people are like. We should to find out what people are really like, we should ask ourselves what we are like, and then infer from the behavior of other human beings that like things are going on within them. And that's this last part about his methodology, right? Now, we got to the first part of the reading where he starts to get into the details. And the first thing he talked about, just to recap, is equality, right? And he broke down equality into two different aspects of human beings. Human beings are equal in that nobody is so strong that no other group of people or individual could kill them, if perhaps smart enough or if they banded together. So equality here is in terms of physical strength. This makes sense because Hobbes, being a mechanist, thinks of human beings essentially as a sort of complex machine. One aspect of the complex machine is the strength of its physical body. So if you're going to talk about the equality of such beings, the only real sense in which you can talk about equality is equality between what features they really have. And that's not going to be between their souls or anything like that, because Hobbes doesn't have any conception of that. Also, it's not going to be sort of modern idea of equality where two people are equal before the law or ought to be treated equally. That's not within Hobbes's kind of way of thinking about the world. Things are equal that have equal capacities or properties. And physically, of course, we are not perfectly equal, but for his purposes, we are as equal enough, right? The same goes for mind in this next passage. So he says people are even less unequal with respect to mind. All of this is important for one reason, that when he's building a state, his notion of the ideal model of a state is, of course, has to be built upon a true knowledge, a scientific knowledge, he believes, of the character of human beings, of the beings within it. So in this respect, his political theory is supposed to be ultimately realistic, meaning it doesn't tell human beings how they ought to be or what the world would ideally be like. His ideal state is simply a description of the best way in which a state could operate given the very unideal human beings that there actually are in the world. Now, what equality means for Hobbes is not that we all need to be treated the same, but rather that we are all equally susceptible to danger from one another. We are both equally dangerous to one another, and we are both equally able to be overcome by one another. So in a certain sense, we're all in the same terrible situation. That's the result of equality. So he says, from this equality of ability ariseth equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. So we have equal hope of attaining what we seek, and therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. So the result of equality, oddly enough, is that we all become enemies. And in the way to their end, endeavored to destroy or subdue one another. And from hence it comes to pass that where an invader hath no more fear than another man's single power, if one plant, sow, build, or other possession, or possess a convenient seat, others may probably be expected to come prepared with forces united to dispossess, to take away, and deprive him of that, not only of the fruit of his labor, but also of his life or liberty. And the invader, again, is in the like danger of another. So, what springs from equal ability? That we see ourselves as equally strong with respect to one another, but also equally weak. And therefore, we believe that we can contend for and perhaps take away from others the things that they have because we want them, right? And so from equality springs what later he'll call a state of war. The state of nature for Hobbes is a state of warfare. Now, this kind of fear of one another, the danger of one another, Hobbes uses this rather unusual word diffidence. You're just going to have to put that in your mind so that when you read it, when you read diffidence, think of fear and danger from another. And from this diffidence of one another, there is no way for any man to secure himself so reasonable as anticipation. So how do we, if we fear and have danger from others, he says there's no better way for one to protect oneself, or more reasonable way, than to anticipate it, right? To act first, preemptively act. That is, by force or wiles to master the person of all men he can, so long till he see no other power great enough to endanger him. So essentially, the most reasonable thing in the state of nature, when everybody is an enemy of everyone else, is to try to subdue as many other people as possible, right? In that way, we protect ourselves from them. Even if they weren't attacking us, we should anticipate that they will attack us, and so it's smart to defeat them, as it were, before they even come up with the plan to attack us. So, to master the persons of all men as long as he sees no power great enough to endanger him. And this is no more than his own conservation requireth, and is generally allowed. So, typical of Hobbes, what is allowed or what should be for him is not what you and I would tend to think it should be allowed or should be. Again, because Hobbes is not talking about the world as it ought to be, as some kind of moral, better world, or the world of justice or something like this, but the real world. And so if it's the case that all people are contending for the same things, and everybody is everyone else's enemy, and everyone is at equal danger, then for him, as he said earlier, it's reasonable to attack people first. And here he adds to it, it's generally allowed. In a state of nature, anything goes. Because why? Because it is no more than is really required by our own preservation, or as he says here, conservation. Also, because there be some that, taking pleasure in contemplating their own power in acts of conquest, which they pursue farther than their security requires, if others, that otherwise would be glad to be at least within modest bounds, should not by invasion increase their power, they would not be able, long time, by standing only on their defense, to subsist. And by consequence, such an augmentation or growth of one's dominion over men being necessary to man's conservation, it ought to be allowed him. So he says a little bit more in this next paragraph about how human beings generally are influenced or and take an interest in pleasing others who have more power in order to kind of be protected by them. That's what's in the next passage. And then he arrives at this very general statement. So that in the nature of man, right, the nature of man, not just so as belonging to the necessary essence of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel. First, competition, that everybody competes for the same things, same food, same land, and so on. Secondly, diffidence, that's fear of the others. And third, glory, right? Now, of these, we're going to see that the second one is the most powerful, oddly enough. So the first, competition, maketh men invade for gain, right? To gain something, we invade other people and invade their land or property. The second, for safety, right? Fear of others leads us to do things to secure our own safety. And the third, for reputation, right? Glory for reputation. The first use violence to make themselves master of other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle. The second, to defend them. The third, for trifles, for as a word, a smile, a different opinion, and any other sign of undervalue, either direct in their person or reflecting on their in their kindred. Now, he makes another bold statement. Hereby it is manifest, it is clear, that during the time men live without a common power, to keep them all in awe, so to awe, you might know the word awful or awe-inspiring, something that, in this case, more or less threatens us and makes us feel, amazed by its power. So as long as men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in the condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man. So the state of nature, this is famously for Hobbes, the state of nature, the state before there is a state, right, is a state of war. Now, that's probably not the best way to put it. Actually, Hobbes never actually uses the language, I believe, of a state of nature. That comes from Locke. So better we should probably say a condition of nature, which precedes the state. That condition of nature is a condition of war. Now, in the rest of this paragraph, he tries to point out that this doesn't cease to be true when everyone is not fighting. So what Hobbes considers a state of war is not necessarily a state of open combat. A state of war is simply any state in which war cannot be prevented and will likely break out. So he says, for instance, you don't say it's good weather if it's cloudy and it's looking dark and like it's going to rain, right? Now, it may not actually be raining right at this moment, but it's still a state of bad weather. And in this way, the state of the condition of war is much like that. It's a condition where there doesn't exist a common power to keep us from fighting. And since human nature is to quarrel, is to compete, is to preemptively strike others to protect ourselves, for that reason, there is an built-in disposition of that condition towards war. And that's what he means by a state of war or a condition of war. Not one where there's necessarily actual combat, but where there's a tendency towards such combat. So during such a time of war, every man is the enemy of every man, etc. In such condition, there is no place for industry. Now we're going to learn why the state of war is so bad. Because there is no place for industry, no place for people to do work, because the fruit thereof is uncertain. Because what we work for, someone might just steal from us, right? And consequently, no culture of the earth, no cultivation of the earth. No one's going to grow crops, because as soon as you spend your whole summer growing your crops and harvesting them and putting your sweat into it, someone comes along and steals it. So what's the point? No one would do that in the condition of nature, because it would be pointless, because you couldn't protect what you produced or cultivated. No navigation, nor use of commodities that may be imported by sea. No one would care to navigate, because as soon as you go off from your own land, you will be attacked by others who will take what you have. Or if you manage to get somewhere else and to trade for something, other people are just going to take it from you. No commodious building, so no large buildings. Why build a large house when people can just force you back out of it? No instruments of moving or removing such things as require much force. No knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. And, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And now comes one of the most famous quotes of Hobbes and of modern political philosophy. And the life of man will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's what life is like in a condition of nature. Let's see. So the next thing, and this is nice because the next consideration that we find in this paragraph is kind of trying to support this claim he has just made. And he supports it using his methodology. Where does Hobbes come up with all these ideas, right? He believes he's come up with them by observing human nature, seeing that this is the way people are. This is the way people would act in a condition of nature, because this is the nature of human beings. Now, he's going to try to give you a taste of where he came up with that idea and a way for you to try to verify it yourselves. So he says, this may seem strange, right? It may seem strange to some man that has not well weighed these things, that nature should thus disassociate and render men apt to invade and destroy one another. So this condition of warfare may seem strange to everyone. Why would people be created to not get along and to kill each other? And that person who would think this strange may therefore, not trusting of this inference, not trusting what I've just shown, made from passions, desire perhaps to have the same confirmed by experience, right? So they may want evidence. Here's what you need for evidence to prove what was above, he thinks. Let him, the one who doubts what Hobbes has said, consider with himself. When taking a journey, he arms himself and seeks to go well accompanied. When going to sleep, he locks his doors. When even in his house, he locks his chests, where he keeps his wealth. And this when he knows there be laws and public officers armed to revenge all injuries that shall be done him. What opinion he has of his fellow subjects when he rides armed, of his fellow citizens when he locks his doors, and of his children and servants when he locks his chests? Does he not there as much accuse mankind by his actions as I do with my words? But neither of us accuse man's nature in it. So he's saying, look, if you believe that human beings are not naturally disposed to theft from one another, to preemptively murdering or killing one another to protect themselves, and so on and so forth, why do you arm yourself when you go out on a trip? Of course, we don't do that anymore. In Hobbes' day, people would carry guns all the time. Why do you lock your doors? Why do you lock your chests? Your own behavior shows that you really do think this of other human beings. And why do you do that? Because you know that you, in their position, might do the same thing. You might want to steal from others. You might want to do these things. And so you believe that they may have those, and you protect yourself against them, right? And then here's the most Hobbesian thing about that, though. So you, by your own actions, confirm his view of man, he believes, or his view of the human being. Now he says, but in doing that, there's nothing wrong in recognizing that this is truly the nature of human beings. Because, again, Hobbes is not a moralist in a sense. It's not like this can be bad. If this is the nature of human beings, then it's simply the nature of human beings. They can't change it. If it's your nature, it's your nature. You cannot change it. So you cannot be blamed for it either. That's why he says before, it's reasonable to attack other people. That's the situation we're in. It's realistic. So in saying, in the fact that you are worried other people will steal from you, that's not, he says here, an accusation against other people. You're not saying anything bad about them. You're just attributing them normal human desires for gain, which we all have. Now, whether this is true or not is another thing, whether this is a negative view of human beings or not. But Hobbes is not interested, nor does he believe that there is any kind of condemnation that should be, cast upon such behavior, because that's the natural behavior in a state of war, or in a condition of war. The desires and other passions of man are in themselves no sin. No more are the actions that proceed from those passions till they know a law that forbids them. So until there is a law, there are no sins. Until there is a law that forbids certain actions, there's nothing wrong with those actions. But when you make a law, it then forbids those actions, right? And those are against the law. Which till laws be made, they cannot know, nor can any law be made till they have agreed upon the person that shall make it. So there are further conditions, right? There are no sins. There are no bad actions until there's a law that forbids them. There is no law that forbids them until one knows of such a law. And there can't be any such law to know until people have agreed upon, through the social contract or the pact or the covenant, on such a law. So oddly, things don't become good or bad in the sense of sinful or not sinful, evil or, immoral, until we have all agreed upon what those laws are. And through that agreement, they become so for The next passage is a little bit interesting because here he says, well, perhaps people will think there never was such a war and a condition of war, and he points to North America as a place where we see this, and this kind of is important because it points out a kind of relevance of his political theory to explaining things in the new world that were being discovered at the time, right? And so according to Hobbes, you always have to think, well, what would this mean? If he's talking about the condition of nature, that is essentially the condition in large parts of the world where there is no law yet existing. So this would be a guide to kind of, well, what must be done in North America? Well, there would have to be laws created and a government created before things would be wrong. And in the meantime, everything is free to do. If you kill an Indian or an Indian kills you in North America, there's just the way the world is, because in North America it is a condition of nature. Whereas in England at the time, there are laws, and so they're no longer in a condition of nature, according to Hobbes. So the same things would not pass or be allowable. Also, of course, even though England at the time had laws, civil war would always be a fall back into a condition of nature. So this is what kind of the civil war and the condition of war are one and the same thing. So even if it never did exist, if the government were to collapse, one would lapse back into a condition of nature, according to Hobbes. Now, this war of every man against every man, to this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent. So this also follows that nothing can be just or unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. Force and fraud and war are the two cardinal virtues. Virtues, right? Two cardinal virtues are fraud and force. So, again, this is just so typical Hobbes. It is through the creation of a state that right and wrong, or justice and injustice, are created. And so aside from that, there's no right or wrong. This means that in between states, as long as there's no super state, right? No world government, what one nation does to another, or what one person from one nation does to another, where there is no common law between them, there is no right or wrong. Murder them, whatever. None of that is wrong. Justice and injustice are none of the faculties either of body or of mind. If they were, they might be in a man that were alone in the world, as well as in his senses and passion. They are, right and wrong, qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. It is consequent also to the same condition that there be no propriety, no dominion, no mine, no thine distinct, but only that to be every man's that he can get, and for so long as he can keep it. So there's no, this is my property, that is your property in a condition of nature. What is my property is what I have for long as I can defend it. Right? That's it. Again, there's no difference between what should be and what is in a condition of nature. Now, in addition to this, the passions, now the question is, why do and where does, and that's what he's going to talk about in the next chapter, why does a state of, an actual state, a civil state, come from? Well, we already know it's going to come somehow through a social contract, because all of you in class were talking about, and you said Hobbes is a famous social contract theorist, right? True. But the question is, if this is the nature of man, how is it that a state arises from that? Why does a state arise from that? And what would be given that, what kind of state should arise from that, right? So we have to consider, he says here, the passions that incline men to peace. So we're going to see the state has a close connection with peace. out of a state of war or out of a condition of war, right? So what inclines human beings towards peace if almost everything in their nature inclines them towards war? Well, fear of death, right? It's a powerful counter fear to open in battle with other peoples. We don't want to die. Desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living. Desire to have a lot of things, right? As we saw, you can't have things in a condition of nature because they're never secure and protected. And a hope by their work, their industry, to obtain them. And we saw before that hope was in vain in a condition of nature. So these three things incline us to try to find a way out of a condition of nature. And reason, now this is, where does the state come from really? So it comes through contracts or pacts, but where really does it come from? It comes from reason. Reason discovers, when thinking about the nature of man, that the only way to alleviate the terror and the torture of a condition of war or a condition of nature is by creating this thing called a state. So, and reason suggesteth convenient articles of peace upon which men may be drawn to agreement. These articles are they which otherwise are called the laws of nature, whereof I shall speak more particularly in the following chapters. So, essentially what happens, according to Hobbes, or what kind of in our ideal model happens, is we find that human beings have these three, right, the three great things that incline them towards war. That leads to a very unpleasant life, short, brutish, and so on, right? But reason allows us to think about what we want and why it is that in a condition of nature, when we directly try to get what we want by taking it from others, why is it that that is so unsuccessful? And what would be a more rational way to do the same thing, of course, to try to get what we want, but without incurring all the problems that arise in a condition of nature? And he says, reason, that intelligent being who would be able to anticipate, the consequences of doing certain kinds of things, would suggest that perhaps there could be certain agreements human beings could come to with one another that would allow them to no longer fear death from one another, to be able to collect things, and to be able to work and to obtain them and not to worry about getting rid of them or losing them all the time. And these things, importantly, are what Hobbes calls the laws of nature. Okay, here's a little tricky in the terminology here. Don't get misled. The condition of nature is a condition in which there are no laws before laws. The laws of nature are not the laws of the condition of nature. They're the laws of the state. There's a whole tradition in legal theory called natural law theory, right? The laws of nature, the natural laws. And these are the laws of a civil state, right? So that's a little bit tricky. Just remember it, that the laws of nature are the laws of the state. The condition of nature for Hobbes has no laws, or no such laws, right? So the laws of nature really come from reason. They come from the articles of peace, or the rules that human beings can agree on, which reason discovers, and through which the state is created. So the chapter here, the first and second natural laws and of contracts. So the right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturale, is the liberty of each man hath to use his power as he will for himself for the preservation of his own nature. That is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which, in his own judgment and reason, he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. So the right of nature, so here he defines what we mean by right. A right of nature. Notice this is not what you and I generally think of as a right. So we say I have a right to healthcare, maybe. Some people believe that in the U.S. a right to not be tortured, a right to such and such. Those are what we generally think of as rights, positive things that we have a right to. But notice Hobbes says a right is the freedom, the liberty to do, to use his own power as he will for the preservation of his own nature. So right is a freedom to use your power to protect yourself, to preserve yourself, and to do so in whatever way. So in a condition of nature, we have a right to anything. We have a right to kill other people. But of course, we have a right to be killed. Other people have a right to kill us as well. So a right is a freedom to use your power for your own self-interest. By liberty, freedom, is understood, according to the proper signification of the word, the absence of external impediments. I'm free to do something means nothing prevents me from doing it, which impediments may oft take away part of a man's power to do what he would, but cannot hinder him from using his power, the power left him according to his judgment and reason, as his reason shall dictate. Okay, so we know what right and liberty or freedom are for him. A law of nature, lex naturalis, is a precept or general rule, right? We think of a law as a rule. Don't do this, do this, etc. Found out by reason, discovered by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do what is destructive to his life, or taketh away the means of preserving the same, and to omit that by which he thinketh it may be best preserved. For though they that speak of the subject use to confound jus, right, and lex, law, right and law, yet they ought to be distinguished, because right consisteth in the liberty to do or forbear, whereas law determineth and bindeth to one of them, so that law and right differ inasmuch as obligation and liberty, which in one and the same matter are inconsistent. So this is, again, very particular to Hobbes. Today, you and I would often think that rights and liberty go together, and so do the laws of nature, right? So we would say, for instance, if I have a right to health care, then there should be a law that secures that I get it, right? And that others do not prevent me from getting it. Now, so they seem to go together, but Hobbes says they are opposites. Why are they opposites? If you have a law, you're no longer free, he thinks. So right has to do with liberty and freedom. The ability to do whatever you want, basically. That's what right is. A law restricts what you're allowed to do. So it's the opposite of right. Right? So creating a law immediately consists in the denial of rights. Now, because the condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason, and there's nothing he can make use of that may not help to him unto him in preserving his life against his enemies, it followeth that in such a condition every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. Right? So in a condition of nature, there are no laws, so there are no restrictions of right. So one has a right to everything or anything, even to another person's body. Of course, they have the right to that, to yours as well. So in other words, we're completely free to do whatever is in our own interest. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man, how strong or wise soever he be, of living out the time which nature ordinarily alloweth men to live. And consequently, what follows? It is a precept or general rule of reason. That's what he said a law is. A law is a precept or general rule found out by reason. So he says here, hence it is a precept or general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace, as far as he can hope of obtaining it. And when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all the helps and advantages of war. The first branch of which is the rule containeth the fundamental law of nature, which is to seek peace and follow it. The second, the sum of the right of nature, which is by all means we can defend ourselves. So, interestingly, right, in the condition of nature, no one can be secure. And therefore, reason would discover that to pursue our own interests, those same interests, the best way is to endeavor peace. And it thereby becomes a law of nature. Now, endeavoring peace, notice this law has two branches, he calls them, right? This first law, because Hobbes is ultimately, again, realistic. Human beings, the fundamental drive of human beings is self-preservation. It's their own interest. Now, they should pursue that, or in fact, they will pursue that because that's what human nature is, to pursue that. In a condition of nature, the best way to pursue that is by trying to conquer everyone else, as we've seen. Unless there's a better option. The better option is to get rid of the state of nature and try to create a better situation in which people are not able to steal from one another and so on. And that means through the whatever is required to create a condition of peace. So remember, peace is not just absence of warfare. It's the actual condition in which something is set up to prevent war from actually breaking out. That's what the state's role is. The state will be a mechanism, as it were, to keep people in awe, to keep them from breaking out into war. And how does it do that? It does that by promulgating laws and enforcing those laws with punishments and, in some cases, rewards, right? So the state becomes a mechanism that we all create together in order to keep everyone in check and to keep us out of a condition of war. That way we can all work and have some security. That's essentially what the state does for Hobbes. It provides us security. Now, as I said, this rule Hobbes is realistic. That whole story, that whole argument only makes sense if we can and expect that such a state will actually succeed, and that by agreeing to it and others agreeing to it, it will actually, come about and be maintained and function. And so, if that's not the case, then we should not endeavor peace, right? Because if we were to endeavor peace, but we could not obtain it, then we would be putting ourselves at a disadvantage, right? Which we ought not to do. We would be acting as if there were a civil state when really there is a condition of war. And we would prevent ourselves from doing things that other people would do in order to get advantage over us. So the rule is not endeavor peace. The rule is twofold. Endeavor peace as far as we have hope of obtaining it. And when we cannot, seek all the helps and advantages of war. The first branch of which is the rule contained at the first fundamental law of nature. So the first law of nature is endeavor peace, right there. Well, that didn't quite work, did it? The second part, seek all the advantages of war in a condition of nature, is called the right of nature, right? That's the right of nature. Now, from this fundamental law of nature by which men are commanded to endeavor peace is derived this second law, deductive method. It's derived. This second law, that a man may be willing when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down his right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. For as long as every man holdeth this right, of doing anything he liketh, so long are all men in a condition of war. But if other men will not lay down their right, as well as he, then there is no reason for anyone to divest himself of his. for that were to expose himself to prey, which no man is bound to, rather than to dispose himself to peace. This is the law of the gospel. Whatsoever you require that others should do to you, that do ye unto them. And that law of all men, and so on, right? So, from the first law of nature, endeavor, peace, flows the second law of nature. Namely, to give up, to lay down your rights, insofar as others are willing to lay down their rights, and so far as is necessary to avoid war against one another. Of course, then he goes on to say, if others are unwilling to do this, then you don't have to do it, right? How is this deductive exactly? Well, interestingly, because this has to do with action, it has to do with what we do. It doesn't seem immediately to be deductive, right? A typical famous, logical argument I've given you before, called modus ponens or something like this, is the syllogism. This is a logical deductive structure. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? Given the premises, if they're true, then the conclusion has to be true because it's a logically valid argument. Well, people often thought also of the way we reason about our actions as also based on a kind of what was called a practical syllogism. So something like this: I want to be wealthy. First premise. In order to be wealthy, I need to get a job. Second premise. Third premise, I will get a job, right? Conclusion, I will get a job. The beginning is a goal I have. That's the first premise, is the statement of a goal or a purpose or an end. The second principle is some statement about a means, how to get that end. And then the third conclusion to the syllogism is the decision to pursue that means in order to gain that end or purpose. Now, so this is deductive. It says there's a goal you have, and then there's a means to that goal, something you must do to get to that goal. And so since you have that goal, and you recognize the rule that says that you have to do X to get the goal Y, then the conclusion is I will do X, right? So this is the deductive structure of these laws of nature. What is the goal? Peace. Endeavor peace. Well, what do I have to do to endeavor peace? I need to give up my rights, because only if I give up my rights, meaning my liberty to do whatever I want, will other people in turn give up theirs, right? And that's how all these laws are going to follow. They're going to be the conditions that for pursuing or making or realizing a condition of peace or state of peace. So, in other words, all the laws that bring into being the state are laws that serve the purpose of endeavoring peace. Now, why endeavor peace? Because peace is the best way to endeavor to preserve and to protect oneself and to prosper, which is the ultimate goal of every human being, right? So we get this kind of deductive. Every human being is driven to preserve themselves as best as possible. If it's possible to do so by peace, that's a better way to do so, and so ought to be endeavored. If it's not possible, for whatever reason, then we should do the other thing. We should go for war. Now, if peace is possible, then we should do the things that will make peace real. And the first of those is the second law, giving up our rights, insofar as others will give up theirs. And this is where he equates it some kind of with this law of the gospel, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Of course, he tweaks it in his own Hobbesian way. Whatsoever you require that others should do to you, that do ye to them. So what you want from others, that's what you should give them. And this was an exchange. To lay down a man's right to anything is to divest himself of the liberty of hindering another of the benefit of his own right to the same. Right? That's what laying down one's right is. Okay, so let's see. Now this kind of exchange we make that I talked about earlier. So by giving up my rights, you give up your rights, right? And we do so in equal degree in order to try to endeavor for peace, right? We give up the right to deprive each other of our things. This declaration, this agreement that we make of reciprocal agreement, right? To renounce certain rights. This is what is called a contract, right? So now you understand why it's called a social contract theory. The state comes about through the transferring of rights, right? The renouncing of rights of ourselves and of others. And also the transferring of rights. If I give you the right to something, so by me renouncing a right, I give you a right? So by renouncing my right to your body, I give you the right to your body, right? That's a kind of exchange. I had the right to it, and you had the right to it before, but now only you have the right to it, right? And I only have the right to mine. That is a contract, this transferal of rights. And when we do that, we have to do it by an explicit contract. And Hobbes is if you read this text, you'll find there's a lot of weird things in it, very legalistic, because for him this is a very legalistic issue. This is a kind of document, the Leviathan, that should give a kind of blueprint for the legal theory of a state. So how judges, contracts work in an actual state. Excuse me. And so he has to give a great deal of attention of exactly what a contract is, how contracts are formed, what can be a contract, what cannot be a contract. In other words, what kinds of rights can you transfer, what kinds of rights can you not transfer. Already now you can kind of say, well, if the whole state's role is essentially to endeavor peace, because the role of endeavoring peace is to preserve oneself and to prosper, then for Hobbes there is no sense in a contract within a state that would renounce all my rights, my right to even preserve myself. Because the condition of the state is that I get something out of it. That's why I agree to the contract. I agree to the contract because I get some rights exclusively for myself. So any supposed contract that would give me no rights is not a true contract. It cannot be, because I have no interest in such a thing and can have no interest in such a thing. So even if I were to pretend to enter into such a contract, I couldn't. This is why for Hobbes, we cannot contract ourselves into slavery, right? We cannot contract ourselves into death. We cannot contract into anything that would hamper our self-preservation. And so there can be no laws in the state that would prevent that. Okay. There's stuff here about how it has to be mutual and so on and so forth. Excuse me. Because otherwise, again, there would be no interest for me to enter into a contract. I'm having some trouble. I breathed something in from outside here. I could have no interest in such a contract if I were to be at a disadvantage. My goodness. Let's see. I think I'm going to have to end this video because I'm having a trouble speaking here. That should be... Maybe I'll make another video in a couple of days to fully cover these, but I think that's probably good for now. So I'll be in touch.